Well, I apologize. I forgot to mute everything down, so we got a little bit of emergency vehicles in the background there, but we'll get going. We'll get there. All right. So we want to come together this morning. We're picking up more or less where we left off last week with Ralph Waldo Trine, and some folks messaged after the service that they did indeed go out and buy the book on Kindle and are enjoying it. So appreciate that feedback and encourage everyone to somehow get a copy of the book and spend some time with it, because Trine was I believe he was a mystic. I mean, he was a very, very clear writer, very powerful writer. You know, it's kind of interesting if you think about this. Emmett Fox says it's interesting that preachers can take one or two sentences in the Bible and it takes them a half hour to explain it, because the words that made their way into Scripture were so encapsulated, so succinct, so right to the point, that that the point is so profound that it takes quite some time to unravel it, if you will, to unfold it, to kind of get the intellect to embrace what the heart already knows. So it's interesting that Wendy picked out the quote by Kahn about attuning ourselves and becoming like a radio receiver, because this morning when I was reading and doing reading and preparing, what came to mind was Ray Stevens' song. He had a hit song some time back, "Turn Your Radio On." Turn your radio on, listen to the music in the air, and it was about attuning ourselves to the presence of God. So the story in the song was that there was an old-timey preacher who was saying that just like you have to take your radio receiver and you have to tune it to the station you want to receive, we have to learn to tune ourselves, the receiver that we are, to tune ourselves to the harmony that God is. So try to keep that idea in mind, that even as we sit here today, there are all kinds of signals passing by us, all kinds of radio signals passing by us, the broadcast TV stations, the radio stations, the communications of the police and the fire, all the airplanes above us, all kinds of signals are passing by us constantly. But we don't hear any of them unless we make the effort, to get a receiver that is capable of receiving that particular type of radio transmission. And then we have to tune it, then we have to select it. We have to choose, we have to make a decision. But once we do that, then we can hear that which was there, but for all practical purposes was not there for us because we weren't attuned to it. So Trine's book, the title of Trine's book is In Tune with the Infinite, and it is in perfect flowing with the quote that Wendy gave us this morning. It's in perfect flowing with the ideas that Ray Stevens expressed in the song. And I'll take it a step further. I'll take this idea of attunement a step further. Rocco Errico, who teaches the interpretation of the Old and New Testament from the point of view of the language and the culture of the people who lived at the time that they were written. He tries to help us put it into a context and to understand what it meant at the time that it was written to the people for whom it was written. And I think it's most important that we consider that, because so many times in our culture we reach out and take things completely out of context, and then we try to assimilate them. We try to make them ours. Mine. We try to get a hold of it, and we don't really understand what that mythology meant to the people of the time. So Joseph Campbell, tells us that the mythology represents the greatest values that we hold. The values are so deep in our psyche that we can't express them in prose, or we can't talk about them in words. But the mythology, the symbolism that is there, that resonates with us. There's something within us that is already attuned to it, and we vibrate. You know, I think of the old commercials back in the days when people actually used tape to record things. Memorex had the commercials, and I think it was Ella Fitzgerald, and she would sing, and it would shatter a wine glass as the glass started to vibrate in harmony with her voice. You know. So think of this, you know, her vocal cords are vibrating at a certain frequency, and that sets the air in motion, and it reaches the glass, and certain pieces of glass, just due to the way that they're constructed, they are going to vibrate. They're going to vibrate naturally. They're going to resonate. They're going to vibrate at that frequency. And if the glass starts to shake enough, it will shatter. So the mythology is like that. There's something within the culture that mythology means something. It has a deeper meaning to them. And the ritual then, according to Campbell, the ritual is the reenactment of the mythology. So when we see a native people, for example, engaged in a dance, they are reenacting the mythology. They are part of that mythology, and it has a deep, deep inner meaning to them. So what we tend to do in our culture is we just go out and grab something. We say, oh, that looks cool, let's do that, you know. And we do not have the cultural background, we do not have the experience, we do not have the context for that ritual to have the same depth of meaning to us. And this is what Rocco Errico is trying to explain to us about the way that our society reaches out, and we kind of grab things from the writings of the Old Testament, we grab things from the writings of the New Testament, we grab things from the Upanishads, and we assign our own meaning to them. And that the meaning that we assign to them may be a very important meaning to us, but they're not necessarily the meaning that the words originally had, that the concepts originally had. And what Rocco Errico is telling us is this idea of prayer is an attunement. An attunement. He wrote a little book called Setting a Trap for God. And the idea was that prayer was trying to capture something that was already there, trying to attune ourselves or attune the soul to something that is already there, see? And we're trying to get a hold of that which already is, much like if we turn our radio receiver on and tune it to the channel, we're trying to get a hold of of the information that is contained in that broadcast and make that information available to us. So in his book, Setting a Trap for God, what Errico tells us is that there are 8 attunements, 8 different things in the Lord's Prayer, which we know as the Our Father. There are 8 different attunements that we have, or that are contained in that prayer, that were in the style, in the context of the Aramaic culture of that time, where by the act of engaging in that prayer, by the act of participating in that prayer, what we are trying to do is we are trying to bring our soul into harmony with that which already is. If we switch back momentarily to this concept of a radio receiver, the way that a radio receiver selects one particular channel, one particular station, out of all of the airwaves, all of the signals that are contained in the airwaves that go past us, is, of course, you have a tuner on your radio. Some of us are old enough to remember when tuners were dials and you turned them, and they actually moved a little string, and the string turned some plates and a capacitor inside the radio. But what happens is the tuner circuit in the radio brings itself into harmony with the frequency of the station that you want to listen to. That's what it is doing. by turning that tuner, you are bringing the tuner into harmony. There's a local oscillator in there that vibrates in harmony at the same frequency with the frequency of the transmitter. What we are trying to do through our spiritual practice, through our education, and through our growth, is we are trying to tune our consciousness, our minds, our thoughts. We are trying to attune all of that to the love of God, to the peace of God, to the health that God is, to the abundance, to the joy, mostly to the joy. Alan Cohn wrote a little book, Let Joy Be Your Compass. And the idea there is that when we find that which allows us to experience joy, we are engaging in that which is more in tune with the infinite, more in tune with the very love of God. Why would the divine create it all? It doesn't need anything. And the concept is it creates for joy. It creates out of joy, and then it experiences its creation, and it experiences joy in its creation. And then, of course, we have the caution there is that many times in our human society, we confuse joy or happiness with pleasure. So what we tend to do is we seek those things that bring us pleasure. And we find out that they don't necessarily bring us joy, don't necessarily bring us happiness. That's a life lesson that we eventually learn. So we want to find that which brings us happiness, which brings us joy, and recognize that what we are experiencing there is some part of the divine creation. So trying in setting up in setting up this book, as we discussed last week, he's talking about opening ourselves up to a greater flow, to a greater attunement. Right? And he says we have to start by understanding this. He calls it the supreme fact of the universe. And in his thinking, in the way that he describes it, the supreme fact of the universe is this thing that we might call God, we might call it the infinite, we might call it love, we might call it by many other names. And he says, I don't care what you call it. I don't care what you call it. It's the same. We are all trying to describe that which is indescribable. We are trying to get back to the ineffable. So whether it's a physicist talking about the singularity of the universe that preceded the Big Bang, or the mystic talking about the all, the one, to me it's the same. There is something back there. There is something back there. Everything that we see came from something, came from somewhere, if you want to consider it. In physics we say, well, the energy somehow became matter at the Big Bang. It became matter, right? And expanded, became stars, became planets, became the universe as we know it. And now we say, well, the universe is not the only universe. There's multiverses. And our intellect is still trying to fathom the magnificence of this universe. And if we contemplate that, we recognize that it all came from one. The mechanics of how it became are not understood, but nevertheless it all came from one. The mystic will tell us very much the same thing, that it all came from the one, the divine. And the way that it came into being was through an act of will or volition of the divine. The divine said, let it be, and there was. And this concept appears in many different cultures in many different ways. Every culture has a creation myth, by the way. Every culture has some idea, some concept that is very vital to that culture of where life came from, where the stars came from, where the planets came from. and most importantly, of the relationship of that particular people, the people who hold that myth, the relationship of those people to the Creator. And I find it interesting is that if you examine the name that different peoples have for themselves, frequently that name means the original people. We are the original people. Everybody else, they're not the original people. Almost, if you look at the concept in the Old Testament of the chosen ones, the real deal, we are the real people. There is this idea that the divine created, and we are close to that Creator. We are close to that Creator. Now, in this idea of we are the real deal, we are the original people, there's also this subtlety of everybody else is different. See, everybody else is second or third. Everybody else is separated from us. They are not like us. And that's the human ego of separation in there. Whereas in fact we all must be the same because we all come from the same place. So we can go anywhere in the ocean, and we can reach down and we can grab a bucket of water and we can analyze that water, and we will find that seawater is seawater is seawater, no matter where we go. Slight variations, slight differences in places depending upon the temperature and where the water comes from and the rivers and those kind of things. But in general, seawater is seawater is seawater. And if you step back far enough, I love the pictures from space where, just we're living on this little blue marble kind of flying through the nothingness of space. There's only one ocean, you see. Now we give it different names depending upon what shore we're standing, If you're in New York, you say, that's the Atlantic. If you're in San Francisco, you say, that's the Pacific. It's the same ocean. There's one ocean. Right? The names that we give it are the differences in our minds, in our concepts. But to the ocean, it makes no difference what you call it. Different peoples look at the same body of water and call it by different names. So the Europeans might stand in New York and say that's the Atlantic, but the Native Americans who were there before had a different name for it, you see. So it doesn't make any difference what name we call God, but it is our concept of God that is most important. What does that name mean? What is the symbolism of that name? So when considering the supreme fact of the universe, Trine says there is this one. It is like the ocean. It is one. It is everywhere presence. All presence. All. Not present, but presence. Presence. The presence that is you is some part of that divine. The presence that is me is some part of that divine. The divine presence. It is all power, all powerful. It is all wisdom. It is all knowing. And that creator, that one, that singularity created through an act of will and volition. It said, let there be. And something, some power that must be part of it, some power took that command, if you want to call it a command, took that intention, if you want to call it intention. Something brought it about. So this is conveyed to us in our culture in the book of Genesis, that in the beginning there was nothing, there was void, there was chaos, there was confusion, there was all a bunch of nothingness. And the voice of God spoke and said, let there be. And out of that chaos and out of that confusion, and in my mind, I see energy twirling, And then it comes down and it coalesces into something tangible. We have the Big Bang, for example. We have the beginning of the creative process. The energy starts to take form, Right? And Einstein told us that matter and energy are one and the same, just like ice and water and ice and steam are one and the same. They're the same thing expressing itself in different forms. So out of what does this infinite create? Out of what does this energy come from that becomes the matter, that becomes the plants, the animals, it becomes our bodies, it becomes our food, and it must come from itself. If the divine is all that there is, then everything that there is must in some way be part of that divine. Now again, he tells us, we don't want to let our egos run wild and say, oh, well that must mean that I am God. Because we are never going to be all that God is. But what we are is some part of God. Much as if you go to the beach and you drop your pail in the water and you pull it out and you look at it, you can see this is the ocean. This is as much of the ocean as I can fit in this pail. But the seawater in that pail is the ocean. But it is not all of the ocean. It is some of the ocean. It is part of the ocean. And the ocean, for our purposes, the ocean is inexhaustible, an inexhaustible supply of water. I had an amusing picture come to my head when we lived down at the beach. Our oldest grandson, who was about 3 at the time, came down to visit, and I took him to one of the stores there, probably Wings, those who lived down there. Took him to one of those stores. We bought the things that grandparents buy, the little bucket with the shovels and the sand sifters and the little forms to make starfish and clams and all those kind of things. And we headed down to the beach down there by the pier at Curry Beach. And I spilled all of these toys out onto the beach, and he picked up the shovel and he started digging a hole, Now this was a magnificent hole. I don't know where he thought he was going to go, but he just dug this hole. And it was maybe 12 inches in diameter and as deep as his little arms could reach with a shovel. And he had this hole, and I was just watching him, how we do. We just sit and watch the kids play and admire them. And he grabs the bucket and he says, Grandpa, give me a bucket of water. He didn't want to go by the water. He was okay on the beach, but he didn't want to go get his feet wet. So I went down and I got him a bucket of water, brought him back in a bucket of water, and he pours the water into the hole. And of course it's beach sand, so you pour the water into the hole and it just disappears, or it just flows down through the sand and it disappears. And he kind of looked up with a look of puzzlement on his face, like, where did the water go? He hands me the bucket. Give me more water, Grandpa. So I go down, I get him more water, and he pours it in, and he gives me the bucket, Now I'm just like a fire brigade. I'm just running back and forth. And the humor of the situation just struck me, like we can be here forever. We're never going to bail that ocean out. I can't move fast enough to give you enough water to either fill that hole or empty the ocean. The ocean is an inexhaustible supply. As far as we are concerned, it is inexhaustible. We want to think of the divine love as that, this inexhaustible, this all-powerful, all-knowing, all-presence that permeates every bit of life in the universe. And the reason that you and I can breathe what the trees give off is that the presence of the divine is within both of us. It has created each of us out of itself. Perfect in our own way. But there's a commonality there. Scripture tells us where 2 or more are gathered, there am I. There's a commonality there. We can breathe the oxygen and the trees can breathe the carbon dioxide because there is a kinship there. So the point that Trine is trying to make in the opening chapter, and last week he gave us the beautiful visual image of the water flowing into the lotus pond and how life just abounded around the pond until someone turned off the supply of water. And the point being, if you turn the supply of water back on, that life returns. And we in that image, in that visual, we are like that pond. See, we are like that abundant life. We are like that that beautiful place where life flourishes. But we want to open that connection to the divine. We don't want to turn off the source. We don't want to block ourselves from the source. And the way that we either increase the size of our connection or decrease the size of our connection is through our thoughts. He says our thoughts are the bridge between our soul and our body, between the spiritual and the physical. We have to keep that in mind, that we have learned, we have come into this world, we have been born into a situation where we have learned and been taught the ways of the world. We have been taught how to do things through manipulation, through physical manipulation. You know, we can go out and we can we can get a hammer and a saw, and we can cut wood, and we can make planks, and we can hammer nails, and we can build things with our hands. And that is how we have learned to do things. And it's a very important skill. But in doing that, we are not always consciously aware of the influx of the divine into our lives. And what we want to learn how to do, because our thoughts are so rooted in the physical, so steeped in the way of the world, you know, in the Machiavellian ways of politics, and the way people manipulate power, and the way to get things done. And I mean, just turn on the TV, just look at any of the shows, and what do they focus on? What is the, you know, TV drama? What is the drama? Drama by definition is a conflict. There has to be some type of a conflict, and that conflict has to be resolved, and who's going to prevail, and how are they going to do it, you know? And that's where it all is. If you think of the chakra system, it's the first 3 chakras. That's where human life revolves. Okay? Go to a grocery store and look at the headlines on the newspapers at the checkout. You know, what does it all revolve? It revolves around survival. It revolves around sex. It revolves around power and control and manipulation. And that's where the human life is. That's the world as we know it. It doesn't have to be that way, but that is typically where it is. When we were studying Jewish mysticism, they talk about 4 levels. They talk about the physical, the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, and the speaker. The speaker. And it is not until the human being becomes the speaker that we start to explore our spiritual power. Thomas Troward called it the 5th kingdom. He said we go through the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, the human, and then we move into the spiritual being. Right? So we want to recognize that this human life that we live is some part of the divine life expressing itself as the human life. But there's more. There's more than just the human life. And it can only express through us as the human life because of the level of consciousness, the opening or the size of the pipe, if you want to consider that we provide in consciousness. So part of the creative process, then, what Troward is telling, Trine is telling us, is that there's a power that responds to thought, and this is nothing new to anyone who's listened to these ideas, right? It's done unto us according to our belief. Now, what is belief, and how do we change belief? These are things that we can explore the rest of our lives. But it's done unto us according to our belief. So if we believe that we are merely human beings and we have to go through life as a struggle and eat our bread by the sweat of our brow and bear our children in pain and all of these sorts of things, and the way to get ahead is to be very sly and manipulative and figure out how to force the situation to make things happen the way we want them to happen, that will be our experience, because it is done unto us according to our belief. And what we want to consider now is that as we enter into the spiritual kingdom, as we enter into that role of the speaker, we are speaking our word. We are speaking the Word of God through us, if you want to consider it that way, when we are speaking of love, when we are speaking of truth, and when we are speaking of beauty. That as we bring our attunement away from the things of the world into the things of the soul, then we have a different experience. Now I want to make a very important point right here, and that is sometimes we get confused and think it has to be one way or the other. So we're in the world, we're making a living, we're building houses, we're going to work, we're doing the things that human beings do. Or we can go sit in a monastery or sit in a cave and just pray all day long. And this is a concept that our society has. It's one or the other, a sinner or a saint. It's just one or the other. And what we have to recognize is that is a false equivalence. That is something that we made up, we human beings made up, and that is not the way that it has to be. See? We can be busy and engaged and in the world and doing the things that we need to do to make a living and the things that we need to do to express the love of God, and we can still be in tune. Still be in tune with the infinite. Brother Lawrence wrote a little book around 1300 called Practicing the Presence, and he was a monk who ran the kitchen in a monastery and learned how to experience the presence of God. He had a little sign, I wish I could remember all of it, but it started up, said, "Oh God of pots and pans and all things." Of pots and pans and all things. Right there in the middle of the soapy water in the kitchen. The love of God was, and he could experience it. So what we want to keep in mind then is we're not talking about not doing anything in the world and just sitting in isolation. But we are talking about experiencing the love and the presence and the activity of God in our activities in the world as we go about our day. So we want to learn, then we want to think what Trine is telling us is we are trying to open ourselves up to this flow. As Emerson said, we are already inlets who may become outlets, but we have to be an outlet. We have to be that outlet. You see, if you take a breath and you fill your lungs with air, you can't take in any more air. You can't. You can try. Maybe you can get just a tiny little bit more in there and a tiny little bit more in there. But at some point you have to give. You have to give your breath back to the trees. There has to be an outlet. So we can't just be inlets. There has to be an outlet. There has to be an expression. There has to be a givingness. Right? So Holmes tells us that love is the self-givingness of spirit through the creative process. There has to be a givingness. So I don't want to just receive all this influx of divine love, of divine knowledge, or divine power, and just try to hold it all bottled up inside of me, because I can't. I will limit that. But if I open myself to the flow, as Trine was telling us, the water flowed through the pond, and the water went through the pond and went down into a little stream through the pasture, and it continued to give, and it continued to give, and it continued to give. As we open ourselves up to be in that stream, to allow that stream to flow through us, then we are in tune. Then we are in tune with the infinite. So whatever our concept of the divine is, perfect love, you see, perfect peace, perfect power, perfect wisdom, whatever that is, whatever the components of that are, all of those are available to us and are in fact expressing themselves through us right now, to the degree that we have attuned our consciousness to the divine. That is what the limiting factor of our lives is. Are we in tune with that power? So Trine goes on to say the supreme fact of the universe is that God is, by whatever name we choose to call it. And it creates through an act of will and volition. But the supreme fact of human life is that we are part of that. We are not separated from it. We are part of that. It is with us here. It is with us now. It is what beats our heart. It is what moves our lungs. It is the wisdom that digests our food. We are already inlets who may become outlets. As Wendy gave us in the opening quote, we can become that radio receiver, but we can also then broadcast what we have received. So now what we want to consider is, do we want to do this? Right? Everything starts with desire. Do we want to know God more completely? Do we want to know love more completely? You know? And I think most of us would say, well, of course, we want to know it all. We want to experience it all. We want to have it all. We want to give it all. We want to be it all. And that's easy to say, you know. But then the question is, are we willing to do? Are we willing to do the practice, to do the things that we need to do in order to more completely experience that love and that presence? Now here's a beautiful part of all this, and I don't know what everybody's background is, where you grew up, what kind of religious education you might have had. But when I was a kid growing up, I was taught more or less that this mystical experience, we'll call it, the experience, Dr. Holmes calls it the conscious awareness of the experience of the presence of God. That's about as close to that definition I think as anybody can come with it. Some religious cultures call it the visit, a visit. I was watching a show the other night and a man said, I had a visitation that lasted for about a month, you see. And I said, yes, I understand. The mystical experience. The dove has alighted, perhaps, as Emmett Fox might say. So there is this presence, and it is already there. But the degree to which we experience it, conscious awareness, the degree to which we are consciously aware of its presence depends upon the quality of our thought. Our thoughts are the bridge, as Trine says. Our thoughts are the bridge between our souls and our physical experience. So do we want to do this? Everybody, all the hands go up and say, it's like being at the sales conference when they say, how many people want to be in the President's Club next year? Yeah, everybody's hand goes up. Everybody wants to sell enough to be in the President's Club. But then they go back to their home office and they find out that they have to change their behavior. And they don't want to do that. Okay? So everybody kind of adjusts in their comfort zone. When I first started in the teachings of religious science, I attended a Mile High Church out in the Denver area, just in the suburb of Denver. I think it's Lakewood or Lakewood, Colorado maybe. Just outside of Denver. Beautiful church. At one time it was the fastest growing church in the Denver area. I think they had a membership of about 7,000 people. The sanctuary was huge. They had 3 services every Sunday. And when I first started, it was a week or a series of 4 or 5 weeks where the minister would talk a little bit and then people would get up and I guess you would call it testify. You know, they would say, well, this is how this happened in my life. And there was a man who got up and said that when he first started in the teaching, he was working in commission sales. So if he didn't sell anything, he didn't make any money. And he said he went and he had a family, he had a home, he had a mortgage, he had children in school, he had all the normal things of life. And he said he went through a month where he only made $40 for the entire month. This was in the late 80s. Only made $40 for the entire month. And he was just beginning his lessons. He was just beginning studying the principles that we teach. And he said he knew that $40 a month not enough, that he was very quickly going to go bankrupt. And he was studying about how the thing that limits us in our experience of life is the avenue through consciousness that we provide. So he said he had a little heart-to-heart with his concept of God. And he said, now I know that the only thing that's limiting here is my concept. And I know that the divine is not limited. And I know that the avenues through which my income can come to me are unlimited. And I open myself up to receive an unlimited flow of income. And he said the next month, he made $8,000. And he said, whoa, he wasn't comfortable with $8,000. But he went from $40,000 to $8,000. From not $40,000, $40 to $8,000 in 1 month's time. He said he had another heart with this concept of God and said, now God, $8,000 a month, and now that's too much for one man to make. I shouldn't be making $8,000 a month. So he said that he agreed with himself that $4,000 a month was a fair income. And he said ever since that day, he averaged $4,000 a month. Some months a little bit less, some months a little bit more, but he averaged $4,000 a month. And he said, but what he learned from that is the only thing keeping him from making $8,000 a month, because he knew it was possible, he had already done it. The only thing keeping him from making $8,000 a month was his acceptance of it. He had to open his consciousness up enough to believe, yes, not only is this possible, but I am worthy of it. See? To me, that was a perfect example of how our belief system limits our experience. And what we are trying to do as you and I, as we step into this fifth kingdom, as we step into the role of being the spiritual speaker in our lives, is to attune ourselves to the infinite, as Trine tells us, in tune with the infinite, the unlimited, that ocean that my grandson had me trying to fill that hole with, the unlimited, the omnipotence, so that we can step into the world, we can step into the day-to-day activity of our lives and see at every moment and feel at every moment and experience at every moment that what we are doing is increasing the size of the outlet that we are. And in increasing the size of the outlet that we are, the inlet takes care of itself. What do you have your mind on? Do you have your mind on God? Or do you have your mind on the world? See, so rather than getting up and going to work in the morning and saying, oh my goodness, how can I do more to make more money? Perhaps the idea then is, how can I let the love of God flow through me more today through this beautiful gift of work that I bring to the world? Khalil Gibran says, if you're going to build a house, build it as if your beloved is going to live in it. What is the gift that you bring to this world? Can you see that it is a gift of God flowing through you? If the trees could be aware, self-aware, do you think that they would say, oh, how beautiful. I take in the carbon dioxide and I give back the gift of life. So we want to start to attune our consciousness into the flow of God, into the beauty of God, into the presence of God in each and every moment of each and every day. We want to keep our mind on the things we want, which is a greater experience of God, and off the things that we don't want, which is a greater experience in the ways of the world. And we have to recognize that we can be in the world but not of the world, and we can do the things that we ought to do in the world, but we can do it in the conscious awareness of the love of God giving itself through us and as us. Every minute of every day. Every minute of every day. You know, I was long before we studied for the ministry. I was reading ideas and going to the church in Denver, and I mentioned to somebody where I worked one time. I said, you know, can we come to work and be absolutely joyful that we're there, that we have this gift coming to us, you know, that life is precious and we are part of it. And somebody said, yeah, you know, I can kind of understand what you're saying, but it's kind of hard for me to imagine the people working in the diaper laundry who say, oh goody, here comes another truckload of dirty diapers. And I said, well, you know, isn't that the gift of health? I mean, somebody's got to wash those diapers. Isn't that creating an environment where beautiful children can grow up in a safe and healthy manner? Yeah, it's messy, yeah, it smells, you know. But isn't that what that really is? Now you can look at it and say, I'm just washing out dirty diapers. Or you can look at it and say, I am the love of God in action. I am the love of God in action, caring for these beautiful, precious little beings. You know? Caring for these beautiful expressions of God's life that have come to this earth, that at this stage of their development they need somebody to care for them. And I am part of that caring. I am part of the caring of God in action, you see. Now, to a casual observer looking into the window with the laundry, you could say, well, it all looks the same to me. But the difference is within the individual. The difference is within the individual's soul. So what we are doing, what we are going to be talking about, what we talk about all the time, but try to bring it in different ways, is you and I recognizing that as human beings, what we can do, the thing that makes us human, what we can do is we can be aware of our thoughts, or aware of thoughts, whether they're our thoughts or just thoughts that are passing by. We can be aware of thoughts. We can direct our thoughts. You know, we can choose. Now, many times we don't believe that, but we can choose what we wish to think about. The thing that just popped in my head was Throw Mama from a Train with Danny DeVito and Billy Crystal, whereas Danny DeVito was easily distracted by cows. No matter what they were talking about, if he saw a cow, he'd just stop and say, ooh, look, cows. It's like he couldn't help but thinking about cows. But we can discipline our mind. We can train our thoughts. We can train this process of what we become aware of and keep our mind on the things we want and off the things that we don't want. We can learn how to focus. We can learn how to meditate. We can learn how to ignore the cows. We can learn how to ignore the extraneous thoughts that come through our mind. We can learn when our emotions are getting hooked on whatever the drama that's going on around us is, and we can take a breath and step back from that and say, that's the way of the world. Now, how are we going to do this with love? As we grow more and more into our attunement, as we open ourselves up more and more, just a simple thing, I'm saying, what would love do in this moment? How is divine love expressing itself in this moment? How can I, as an instrument of God's love, how can I be of service in this moment? How can I open the giving portion of me? Because the receiving portion of me is already in tune, has already available to it everything it needs. I just have to attune myself to it, and a quick way to do that is through gratitude, is through giving. I'm so grateful for what I have and what I can share. See, I love the whirling dervishes when they twirl and they've got one hand up and one hand down, and one hand is to receive from the love of the divine, and the other hand is to allow that love to pass through them to the world, right? And this is the image that the Sufi mystic Wendy quoted in the beginning. This is the image that they gave us, not quite in the visual, they gave it to us in the form of something we're more familiar with, the radio receiver. But think of that whirling dervish, or think of yourself as a beautiful instrument of God's love, standing there with one hand up and one hand down, receiving and giving, and the giving is as important as the receiving. Perhaps even more so, because the receiving, what we are about to receive has already been given. The gifts have already been given, right? But we have to accept them, and one way to accept them is to give. What do you have to give? You have love. You have love to give. You have kindness to give. You have compassion to give. You have abundance to give. Not because of you. If you think it's because of you, you are limiting yourself. Because you are a channel of divine love. What do you need to know? It is already known. Attune yourself to it. So we're going to stop for here for this week. We'll pick up with Ralph Waldo Trine next week, where he talks about health and vitality, and we may even bring in some other teachers' ideas on the topic of health. But for this week, as you go through your practice this week, as you go through your life this week, just ask yourself this one question. How can I be a greater expression of love in this moment? How can I be a greater expression of love in this very moment? I don't care what your activity is. If it's the laundry, if it's going to work, if it's driving a car, if it's cutting the grass, how can I be a greater expression of God's love in this very moment? Periodically during the day, you want to set a little timer on your watch to beep at you every 15 minutes. Ask yourself that question. What were you just thinking? What was I just thinking? What was I just doing? And how can I be a greater expression of God's love in this very moment? Love is the experience of unity. That's the definition of love that I like the best. Love is the experience of unity. The divine is already one. The divine is already one with us, with all things, with all persons, right? That's why we're told if you don't know God, you don't know love. If you don't know love, you don't know God. Perfect love casts out fear, because fear is the idea of separation, and the divine cannot be separated from itself. The divine knows love. So when we bring ourselves to the question of how can I be a better expression of love in this moment, what we're saying is, how can I experience more unity in this moment? What separates me in this moment? Am I willing to let go of that separation? Try it for a week. Try as often as you can. Try to ask yourself, what was I just thinking? Is it an idea of love or an idea of separation? How can I be a greater instrument of your love? I love the prayer of St. Francis that we learned as a kid. And just very quickly, because I realize that we've got a late start, we're going a little bit over. But during the First World War, they found, we used to call them holy cards as kids. And there were little cardboard cards that we had that had a picture of a saint on it. And the idea was that, the idea of the life of a saint was this was someone whose life was worth emulating. This was someone who was so close to God that it was worth our time to try to be like them, to try to study them. And a soldier, they found a soldier, or they found this card on a battlefield that apparently a soldier had written. And on the holy card, he wrote this prayer, which became known as the prayer of St. Francis. St. Francis never said it. They found it on a card with St. Francis's picture on it, St. Francis's name. And it starts out, it says, "O Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. O Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. And I would change that a little bit. I would tweak that a little bit. We don't need to be made an instrument of God's peace because we already are. The divine cannot do more to make us an instrument of its peace and its love than it has already done. The gifts have already been given, but we can accept. So I would change that and say, "Oh Lord, I already am an instrument of your peace. Today I open my heart more fully to allow that peace to flow through me. Where there is hatred, I sow love, starting with myself." Practice the presence this week. Experience the love this week. Next week we'll pick up with health. And so it is.